The tarot is a popular game of cards whose origins date back to the beginning of the 15th century. Amongst the antique models appreciated by the players in the past, the one known as Tarot of Marseille is still widely used today by fortune tellers for divinatory purposes. As with all tarots, this particular type has, in addition to the traditional suits, a series of 22 cards, the trumps. Owing to the strange figures that illustrate them, for centuries, these trump cards have exerted a strong power of fascination. What do they mean? Who created them? For what purpose? Through the twists and turns of an inquiry, principally focused on 4 cards, this film sheds light on an amazing hypothesis, according to which the Tarot of Marseille is not an ordinary playing card game, but constitutes the occult vehicle of a deep and complex philosophical teaching. The French Playing Card Museum is at Issy-les-Moulineaux, in the suburbs of Paris. There we meet Thierry de Paulis, a historian specializing in the history of games.
This type of tarot, there, which is one of many types, is usually called Tarot of Marseille. It's a conventional designation, most probably due to the fact that at the end of the 18th century, and during the first half of the 19th, and even after, this model was produced only in Marseille. So people got into the habit of calling it Tarot of Marseille. But in fact, it is possible to distinguish an Italian origin to these cards. Many of us think, and this is not peculiar to the fortune tellers, that these trump cards form a series with a meaning. So we tried to understand what these cards meant. Here is the Chariot with the mysterious initials VT. Temperance, which we see holding 2 jugs, allowing her to pour water into wine so as to temper it. Then we find the card of the World, so typical of the Tarot of Marseille, with this mandorla, the symbols of the 4 evangelists that do not appear in other types of tarots, in fact. And this seems to be specific to the Tarot of Marseille. All this is very intriguing indeed. We have lost the keys to these things, and when we try to understand the origin of these cards, we must look into the graphical universe of the 15th century. There is no way we can escape it. The manuscripts, the engravings, the writings of the 15th century, to try to gather the elements of an understanding, and it is not certain we shall succeed.
Getting back to the origins of these tarots thus implies the need to investigate the art of the 15th century. But where should we begin? We leave Paris for Hungary. It is an article published in 2007 in the Hungarian press that drives us in that direction. An art restorer working on frescoes recently rediscovered in the castle of Esztergom, 50 kilometers north of Budapest, had just announced having recognized in them the hand of one of the greatest masters of the Renaissance, the painter Sandro Botticelli. Now, this fresco presents striking similarities with one of the trump cards of the Tarot of Marseille, Temperance. On the restoration site, in the depths of the castle, we are received by the restorer, Zuzanna Wierdl. The fresco in question represents the cardinal virtues, amongst which, precisely, temperance.
This fresco was unearthed in 1938, which means that this small study and the chapel remained 340 years under the earth.
The upper layers of the fresco, covered by late overpaintings, very damaged by their underground stay, have been cleaned, which revealed the very nice preparation layer which we see today. Direct observation of the fresco confirmed the connection that the pictures published in the press had led us to believe. We present the temperance card to Susanna Wedel.
No. Carino.
Strangely, she had never compared this image to the masterpiece she is restoring.
It's impressive. Look at that temperance. It's the same position. Exactly. It is almost unbelievable. The card's temperance has exactly the same position, same inclination of the two jugs. Unbelievable. And it's also the same type of jugs. This one and this one, they are identical. And even in this strand of hair too, this is also the same. Here, exactly the same. I cannot believe it. Well, this is quite amazing. This is fantastic.
But who is the author of the Esztergom frescoes? As she was restoring the original painted layer, Susanna Wedel recognized in this work the hand of the Florentine master, Sandro Botticelli. She compares the temperance fresco to other works ascribed to him. The Birth of Venus of the Uffizi Museum in Florence. Or Venus and the Three Graces presenting gifts to a young woman, today at the Louvre Museum.
The upper layers of the fresco, which cause confusion, have been removed, and an entirely new image appeared. That's what allowed the attribution of the fresco to Botticelli. If you compare it to Botticelli's masterpiece, The Birth of Venus, you see that the line of the neck is typical of Botticelli. See how the lines of the neck correspond almost perfectly. If you incline slightly, because Temperance's angle is a little more tilted, you realize that Temperance's neck is typical of Botticelli. You also see that the shoulder has no bone, and it is the same in this fresco. There are also correspondences with this head from the Lemmy Villa fresco. Just as with the Venus.
In effect, there is a strong likeness between the temperance of Esztergom Castle and that of the Tarot of Marseille. Susanna Wedel's attribution, if it is right, provides a clue linking the Tarot of Marseille to Botticelli. In this case, further correspondences should be identifiable. To make sure, we check the known works of the Florentine master. One of them presents eye-catching similarities with another trump card of the Tarot of Marseille. It is a large format drawing kept in Berlin. Here is a real-size reproduction. We scale it down to the size of a tarot card, so as to underscore its similarities with the 15th trump of the Tarot of Marseille, the Devil. A character standing viewed from the front with his legs slightly apart. The clawed feet. The horns on his head and the crossed eyes. The bat's wings that unfold in the superior angles of both images. But most of all, the center of the two compositions. In the card, the target is explicit. It is more subtle in the drawing. Botticelli drives the observer's view with a circle drawn around the central point, just as a target. There, we clearly distinguish, in the middle of the tufts of hair, the male genitals of Lucifer. But for what reason do both images have the sex of the demon in the center of the composition? Obviously, the trail of the devil leads to a question mark. Before returning to it, we have to go back to our point of origin and start over with another trump card. In Issy-les-Moulineaux, Thierry de Paulis had given us a clue which redirects our investigation.
So, here is one of the treasures of this museum. It is this card of the chariot, which was purchased on the art market about 20 years ago. And we think this card was painted around 1455. As it appears, the style is very different from the so-called Tarot of Marseille. But we are on a different note, princely here, the other more for the masses. And finally, it is a different technique, because it is illumination. With these golden backgrounds, it is gold leaf.
What strikes most in this card is the similarity of its composition with that of the seventh trump of the Tarot of Marseille. The chariot. A very peculiar composition. Two equal parts, separated by the upper edge of the chariot's basket. But in fact, the chariot of the Tarot of Marseille is also inspired by other drawings and engravings, all Italian and dated from the 15th century. In this image, representing the Chariot of Faith, engraved in Florence around 1460 by Maso Finiguera, we find the team of two horses almost identical. The likeness is also striking with this sketch by the Venetian Jacopo Bellini, drawn around 1441. And here, we also have the canopy in the upper part with its vertical poles. The composition and the car of the Ferrara chariot. Finiguera's horses. Bellini's canopy. These are the elements borrowed from Italian works of the 15th century, which composed the chariot of the Tarot of Marseille. Yet something remains intriguing. In none of our models can we find the trace of the young charioteer of the chariot card. What does this young man driving his chariot represent? With the origins of the Tarot of Marseille being in Italy, it is there we are most likely to find the answer to our question. In Italy, and more precisely, in Florence. The theme of the chariot driven by a young man is popular in Florence in the second half of the 15th century. Important testimonies of it are still visible today. In the church of San Miniato al Monte, which overlooks the city, there, on the tomb of the Cardinal of Portugal, erected between 1461 and 1464, a bas-relief shows the young man driving his chariot. At the National Museum of Bargello, in the room dedicated to Donatello, the same chariot appears on the bust of a young man, dated around 1460. In the oval medallion he is wearing around his neck. What could these chariot representations mean at that time? At the Laurentian Library, one of the oldest in Florence, Andrea Rabasini, a historian of philosophy, puts us on the track of the image that inspired our Florentine chariots. An image conceived in Athens in the 4th century before Christ by one of the founding fathers of Western thought.
This Greek manuscript contains the complete works of Plato with other writings. Here the Phaedrus, so Plato's dialogue in the original Greek text. And here we find in these pages a Platonic myth that deals with the soul. In it, the soul is described as a chariot, a winged chariot, driven by a charioteer, and which is pulled by two horses, one who raises it upwards, whereas the other pulls it down. And it is up to us to let the rational guide prevail over the world of passions that drag us downwards.
Strikingly, this description of the chariot of the soul by Plato is faithfully reflected in the team of horses in the chariot of the Tarot of Marseille. Here is what Plato had written in his famous Phaedrus dialogue. Of the two horses, one is good, but the other is not. In the chariot of the Tarot, at first sight, there is no better or worse horse. However, a more thorough comparison of the two figures allows us to notice some surprising disparities. And these differences seem to reflect the portraits Plato had made of the two horses. The first one, wrote Plato, which stands at the right hand, is upright and has clean limbs. He carries his neck high. On the card, the horse standing to the right of the charioteer faces in the direction of travel. His eyes are turned in the same direction. He is well proportioned. His ears stand upright. The other, however, Plato wrote, is crooked, heavy, ill-conceived. His neck is short and thick. His nose flat, his color dark, his eyes grey and bloodshot. He is shaggy-eared and deaf. On the card, the horse standing to the left of the charioteer holds his head perpendicularly to the direction of travel, a fractious animal. One of his eyes is closed, while the other is bulging. His turned back ears give reason to fear that he is preparing to kick. It looks like the creator of this picture has tried to transpose the image of Plato in this card. But one doesn't see very well what this image of Greek antiquity is doing in Florence in the second half of the 15th century. In reality, the chariot didn't reappear at that time by mere accident. We owe its revival to a certain Marsilio Ficino, a figure known today only to a few specialists. However, in the time of the Renaissance, when Florence was at the peak of its splendor, this man was one of the greatest savants. The son of a doctor, he entered in his youth the service of Cosimo the Elder, the founder of the Medici dynasty. All his life he remained closely related to the family that reigned over Florence, and kept up a lifelong friendship with Lorenzo the Magnificent. A few years after his death, Marsilio Ficino was judged to have been highly illustrious, to the point of having his bust erected in a good place in the Cathedral of Florence. The feat that motivated this glory was represented by the sculptor as a book in Ficino's hands. His Latin translation of Plato's dialogues.
Marsilio
Ficino is famous for being the first person to have translated Plato's complete works from the Greek to the Latin. And this translation with Ficino's commentaries was highly influential. Before Ficino, in the Middle Ages, only a few writings by Plato were known. With Ficino's achievement, it is the first time that Plato's complete works are really available to those who could read Latin. That is, the scholars, the educated persons of that time.
Thanks to Ficino's translation, Plato was revived in Florence, and with him the dialogue of the Phaedrus and its chariot. But Ficino was not only a philosopher and a translator, he was also ordained a priest and even became a canon of the cathedral. To gain a better acceptance of Plato's works by the Christian West, which had remained wary of him, he endeavored to harmonize his thought with the Christian doctrine. Ficino considers Plato as a forerunner of Christ, and he does not hesitate to see in him a prophet. But to reach this concord, Ficino sometimes elaborates a little on what Plato had written, notably in his commentaries on the Platonic dialogues. Such is the case in his commentary to the Phaedrus, in which Ficino pays particular attention to the chariot of the soul. In these lines, Ficino enhances the image of the chariot with details that the original Greek text did not mention. Now, these details, invented by Ficino, do show up in the chariot card of the Tarot of Marseille. In particular, Ficino writes that the charioteer's head is at the same time one and doubled. In the chariot card, we see two masks on the charioteer's shoulders, extending his head on both sides as if it doubled itself. He also indicates that the two horses are tied together for eternity. In the chariot, the two horses of the team have no hindquarters, and thus seem to be joined at the body, as if they were Siamese twins, at the same time separated and forever united. So the chariot card seems to represent the chariot of the soul as Plato had imagined it, and better still, as Ficino had reinterpreted it. Could it be the case that Ficino himself played a role in the elaboration of these figures? But why would he have done it on playing cards? Let's have a closer look at that singular person. We are driving towards the village of Careggi on the hills overlooking Florence. Since the 17th century, Franco Mercatelli's family has been living in the neighborhood of Marsilio Ficino's house, which we can see. It was heavily transformed through the centuries, and current renovation works prohibited us from accessing it. The small estate had been given to Ficino by Cosimo de' Medici as a reward for his translations. This might be the place that Ficino evokes in his introduction to Plato's complete works, a place he calls the Academy.
The Platonic Academy was a gathering of important figures of the time: Lorenzo de' Medici, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and others, who used to meet here to discuss about Plato, and it was a pleasant place, quite beautiful.
In his introduction to Plato's works, Ficino evokes the activities of this academy.
Here, in the Platonic Academy, here, he says, the youth will acquire usefully and easily, while playing and having fun, the moral precepts and the art of dialectics. In the gardens of the Academy, the poets will hear Apollo in person, singing under the shadow of the laurel trees. Finally, in the deepest sanctuary, the philosophers will recognize Saturn, contemplator of the heavenly mysteries, while the priests will conceive, for the whole Academy, the weapons with which they will defend religion against the assaults of the impious.
So, in Ficino's academy, inspired by Plato's one, they imagined weapons to fight against impiety. The youth trained in morals and dialectics while playing. In other words, they played to learn. Ficino does not say what these games were. What if they were our cards? Pedagogical card games are common nowadays. But in the 15th century, is it not an anachronism? We are heading to Milan. At the heart of the Lombard capital, in the Sforza Castle, the Achille Bertarelli print collection keeps a remarkable ensemble of playing cards, some of which date from the Renaissance. There we meet Alberto Milano, a scholar specialized in iconography, who presents us with one of the first pedagogical games of cards.
At the Sforza Castle, we have a very special pack of cards. The game is dated 1515 and was created by the Franciscan monk Thomas Murner to teach the Institutes of Justinian to the students at the Faculty of Law. You couldn't play this game with the usual rules of playing cards. The game was used to memorize some concepts.
The deck was used by the students to revise the Institutes of Justinian, a Roman law textbook. The cards present objects such as combs, acorns, or buckets. Each object bears an inscription that sums up one of the paragraphs of the Institutes. The student, having drawn a card, was asked to recite for each object the corresponding paragraph. So, in 1515, the university professor Thomas Murner had invented a game of cards to teach law to his students. Could it be that Ficino, a few decades earlier, had also imagined a game to train his fellow academicians in philosophy? Fittingly, during our visit, Alberto Milano had drawn our attention to a very specific trump card of the Tarot of Marseille.
Here we have some playing cards for the game of tarot, which were discovered in a well when the Sforza castle was being restored in the beginning of the 20th century. In particular, there's this card of the world that's probably the oldest preserved of this type, called Tarot of Marseille.
Oggi come Tarocco di Marsiglia.
Tarot of Marseille is a misleading name, as we've known for some time already. This name is an addition, a usual name, which probably dates back to the 18th century.
I fabbricanti di carte da gioco che fabbricavano carte di questo tipo.
We must consider that there were hundreds of card makers that produced these type of cards. It's very interesting to observe that the basic iconography was well maintained. Therefore, there is a direct relation between this first specimen and this other, much later French one.
The complex figure that this 21st trump of the Tarot of Marseille bears gives us an additional clue, leading to the possible implication of Marsilio Ficino in the creation of this game. This image reflects a frequent theme in medieval art. Christ in glory within a mandorla, surrounded by emblems of the four evangelists, as we can see, for example, on the royal portal of the Chartres Cathedral. But it combines another source with this figure. This one, not medieval, but antique. The image of the Orphic god Phanes, the androgynous born from the world egg. Here on a bas-relief kept in the Museum of Modena. Now we know that Marsilio Ficino was endeavoring to operate the synthesis between Christianity and the theologies of antiquity. In fact, it seems that the world card represents the soul freed from the body, as Ficino describes in his treatise on the immortality of the soul, the Theologia Platonica. According to him, the soul, after it takes off its bodily envelope, rises up and becomes capable of governing the four elements of the universe. Ficino compares this free and almighty soul to the Son of God and assimilates it to the world soul. Finding the influence in the Tarot of Marseille of Marsilio Ficino's thought on the one hand and the art of Botticelli on the other naturally suggests the idea that these two men, who were contemporaries and both close relations of Lorenzo de' Medici, might have collaborated to create its trump figures. To explore this hypothesis, we go to the Louvre Museum, which conserves the Botticelli frescoes found in the Villa Lemmi of Careggi. There, we meet Stéphane Toussaint, a researcher specializing in Renaissance philosophy and president of the Marsilio Ficino Society.
This fresco takes us back to 1484 to 1486, in a villa on the hills around Florence that belonged to a family related to Lorenzo de' Medici. In fact, very closely related to him. Is there any better example than this fresco to bear witness to the fusion between Marsilio Ficino's ideas and the art of his time, and particularly with the art of Botticelli, this fresco being signed by Botticelli? Here we have the three graces. Youth dressed in green, joy represented in white, innocent, the joy of a pure soul, and there in yellow, like a shining sun, splendor, or glory. For Marsilio Ficino, notably in his treatise on life, the De Vita, written in 1489, and elsewhere in the letters Marsilio Ficino sent to the circle of his Florentine friends, the cult of the Graces, the worship rendered to the Graces, is a fundamental element that is central to both the intellectual and social life. Is there any better illustration of the migration of the ideas, and most of all, of the incarnation of the Ficinian and Platonic ideas in the Florentine society of the time?
So Marsilio Ficino's thought influences the art of Botticelli. How did this influence exert itself on him? And above all, for what purpose?
One thing is certain. Ficino followed the principle and idea to make his philosophy accessible and to put it into practice in a very concrete manner. For a long time, Ficino was considered as a thinker, abstracted from reality, living in an elitist circle, without relations with the artisans, the artists, the engineers, the common man of Florentine life. In reality, we now know that Ficino had contacts and friendships with some artisans and artists. I think the better example we can mention regarding this is the care with which he had entrusted such craftsmen with the making of some talismans, clockworks, to illustrate his philosophy. For Ficino, the heavenly harmony could be translated into works intended to be contemplated by the philosopher or even the common man. In his De Vita, dated 1489, Ficino even gives recommendations on the way one should live, possessing around him objects that represent and convey this harmony. It can be magic talismans, emblems, and in this case, even if he doesn't talk about it in the De Vita, some tarots or a game of cards could possibly be part of this arsenal, but he doesn't talk about it himself. In particular, he talks about a clock, a zodiacal clock, built by an artisan called Della Volpaia, which Ficino names amongst his friends, and this is very important.
Ficino's interest for this clock can be explained by the fact that he practiced astrology himself. And, as most of the scientists of his time, he integrated this traditional knowledge perfectly with his philosophical and religious conceptions. It's worth noting that some trumps of the Tarot of Marseille are compellingly evocative of astrological images. Let us now return to the trail of the devil. So why is the sex of the demon at the center of the image in the cart of the devil, as in Botticelli's Lucifer? Botticelli's drawing is an illustration for Dante's Divine Comedy. In this threefold poem, Dante had narrated his initiatory journey under the guidance of the Latin poet Virgil, through hell, purgatory, then paradise. In the scene depicted in our drawing, Dante and Virgil have gone through the successive circles of hell. They arrive at the center of the earth, in front of Lucifer. Dante is frightened. Virgil reassures him. Virgil takes Dante on his back to climb down. And at that point, they carry on upside down. Logical. After they go past the center of the earth, gravity is inverted, and the descent becomes an ascent. If Botticelli puts Lucifer's sex in the center of the earth and in the middle of a target, it's to underscore the idea of a link between sexuality and damnation. The point of attraction of all heavy matter represents the almost irresistible power of physical desire. And one has to go beyond this point in order to reach purgatory, then paradise. Having the same composition, The card of the devil of the Tarot of Marseille expresses the same idea. But in the card, instead of Dante and Virgil, we have two prisoners. Who are they? Again, Plato and Ficino put us on the trail. The allegory of the cave, imagined by Plato, features prisoners bound in a dark cave, who see the world only through distorted shadows, and who think these confused projections are reality. The story is usually interpreted as an image of the illusory nature of sense perception. But Ficino combined to the allegory of the cave the Christian visions of hell that belonged to his time. Some of his writings bear witness to this. In 1495, he publishes his letters. This one is dated 1480. There he quotes the allegory of the cave, but he adds details that cannot be found in Plato's text. Ficino writes that the prisoners have their hands tied behind their backs. This is not mentioned in Plato's text. He writes that a torch is lit up behind the prisoners' backs, and neither is this mentioned in Plato's text. However, the bound hands, the burning torch, we find them in the devil card of the Tarot of Marseille. This single image merges together Christian hell and Plato's cave. Because of the originality of his thought and writings, Marsilio Ficino had drawn the suspicions of heresy and magic upon himself. It's mostly thanks to Lorenzo the Magnificent's support that he managed to escape condemnation by the ecclesiastical authorities. Such threats might explain why the creator of the Tarot of Marseille never publicly boasted about his invention. But what does it really mean to merge Plato's cave with Christian hell? For Plato, was the allegory of the cave not supposed to show that the sensible world is only an illusion? How does this relate to hell? Ficino had a very peculiar conception of hell, which contrasted with the doctrine of the Church, but on the other hand, agreed very well with Plato's thought. As Sylviane Bogdam, a specialist of Renaissance literature, explains. We are at the Arsenal Library in Paris.
Here we have the first edition of the commentary to Dante's Divine Comedy, published in 1481 by Cristoforo Landino, a friend of Marsilio Ficino. And here we can see an engraving by the Florentine Baccio Baldini, who illustrated this edition on the basis of drawings by Botticelli. The passage illustrated by this engraving is the one in which Virgil and Dante are about to go through Hell's Gate. And this gate is represented as the door of a cave. So this is a reference to the 6th book of Virgil's Aeneid, but we also think about the Platonic cave. Ficino talks about hell, notably in a text entitled The Platonic Theology, in which he proposes a very original conception of hell. For Ficino, hell is no longer a material place, but it is neither only an allegorical place, as it was for the Latin poet Lucretius. For him, hell is a state of the soul after death. It's a psychic prison in which the damned person is condemned to live eternally amongst the illusions to which he had indulged himself during his earthly life. Thus, hell is an imaginary place. It is a world made up of what Ficino calls simulacra. But it is a world of simulation that the damned person cannot identify as such and of which he is a prisoner. Ficino's hell is a nightmare.
but it is a nightmare from which you never wake up. For this reason, I think Ficino's hell is the cave, because hell is a world of illusions, which you cannot identify as illusions, which you take for realities. Likewise, Plato's cave is a prison, in which the caveman is shut away, because he cannot recognize the sensible world as it is, as a simple image. And therefore, he has no desire to turn over, to convert to the light of truth, and to the principle of this light, which, for a Platonist like Ficino, for Plato firsthand, is the good.
So, the devil would be Plato's cavern, as seen by Ficino. The chariot would be Plato's chariot of the soul, as seen by Ficino. And temperance? What does it represent? And the world? And the other cards? A text by Ficino, which remained unexplained to this day, of numerological and astrological inspiration, presents the soul as a table consisting of 7 columns, one for each planet known at that time, and 3 levels: the heavenly, the intermediary, and the earthly. The indications provided by this strange text allow us to place each of the trump cards of the Tarot of Marseille in each of the 21 boxes of the table, following a different order than the simple numerical progression. And Ficino points out, as an enigma, that these 3 series begin with 3 multiples of 7. In the first column, that of Jupiter, which for Ficino corresponds to the world soul, the 3 multiples of 7 take place. 7, the soul in its terrestrial vehicle, vehiculum terrenum. 2 times 7, 14, the soul as an intermediary between the heavenly and the terrestrial. 3 times 7, 21, the heavenly soul governing the world. Then comes the column of Mars, masculine and violent. The column of Venus, feminine and loving. Those of the sun and the moon unite the feminine and the masculine. Day and night, action and contemplation. That of Mercury illustrates various uses of speech, persuasion, treason, confusion. That of Saturn concludes on divine justice and the end of times. According to this interpretative framework, the series of 22 trumps of the Tarot of Marseille appears as a synthesis of Marsilio Ficino's philosophical, religious, and astrological thought. Born under the sun of the Renaissance, the Tarot of Marseille later faded away into a night of enigma, keeping within itself the treasures of wisdom that had been entrusted to it. The cards are far from having revealed all their secrets. Who knows if the last keys of the so-called Tarot of Marseille do not remain buried in the writings of Marsilio Ficino.